And one thing in the past debate, we had a problem with the connectivity of the intro. So is it okay if last minute someone else from our team does the intro if he's not able to connect?
Yes, of course. I believe that's what other teams have been doing in the previous rounds if the problem has occurred. So
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Okay, so I believe we are all here, and in about 2 minutes we can start the debate. Let me just note the speakers in each turn.
Yeah, and Blanca, I think we are still missing Elena Gillis.
Thank you, Pedro. We will wait for her. 1 second. Yes, we're missing her. Okay. So we're still waiting on our on Elena, our judge, to join the room. Are all teams ready except for that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. So sorry for the delay. We'll start as soon as Elena fixes her connection.
Yep. And I would like to say hello to the other team. We've seen each other in the final before.
I'm glad. I'm glad. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
Okay, it appears that Elena. Elena, can you hear us?
Hello, I'm here.
Wonderful. Okay, so whenever the introductor in Los Bolivarianos, which I believe is David, is ready to start, feel free to do so. And just, David, 1 second, sorry, just a reminder, when I believe the debaters have to leave the room after the debate finishes so that we can adjudicate a call. Does that make sense?
Okay, should I start?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Wait the timer. Her name was Anna. She was 7 months pregnant. Her baby was diagnosed with HIV even before being born. Actually, technology was already sufficient to remove the virus in the fetus. However, the treatment is not FDA approved and thusly could not be carried out. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Aitan, and with my team, we will answer the question of today's debate. Should governments remove all regulations in genetic modification? With a strong yes. We should indeed remove all kinds of limitations in genetic modification because doing so, we shall take advantage of all its full potential. We will hold our thesis with 2 clear arguments: health and transparency. However, I would like to present the context of genetic modification before introducing our 2 arguments. Genetic modification shall be defined as the artificial alteration of genetic material of a living being in order to produce a given characteristic. In the present, this can be done in any laboratory through a method called CRISPR gene editing. It is a technique of genetic engineering through which existing genes can be removed in order to add new ones with almost perfect precision, meaning that any characteristic can be introduced in any living being just by finding the correct genes with that given characteristic. Now, starting with our first argument, health. We will defend that deregulating genetic modification would greatly benefit us humans regarding our health. Genetic modification has allowed the development of vaccines and medicines such as the hepatitis B or malaria vaccine. Currently, we can even directly modify a human to be immune to given diseases and viruses, acting like a permanent vaccine for the persons who receive the modification and their descendants. This will have a huge impact on human health, especially in underdeveloped and developing countries, since if it were not for the high arbitrary regulations of government and international organizations have on genetic modification, it would be rather inexpensive to genetically modify a human. This is because CRISPR technology is very inexpensive and can be carried out in any single laboratory. Therefore, in order to take advantage of all its full potential in human health, governments should remove all arbitrary regulations. Lastly, we bring a second argument of transparency. Like it or not, investigations and use of genetic modification will be carried out, either by governments with political or military purposes, or firms with economic interests. Currently, we do not know with certainty all the power that genetic modification has. In other words, what are the limits of genetic modification? In order to be aware of the potential of genetic modification, we need transparency, and this should only be achieved if investigations can be carried out without the intervention and coercion of governments. This way, we can be aware of the cans and cannots and be prepared for what might happen. We certainly do not want the wrong people to have the power of genetic modification without us even knowing what the real power of it is. Just imagine North Korea having genetic weapons while we do not even know what this can do. This means that the ones who will essentially take advantage of genetic modification for wrong purposes will still do it regardless if it is regulated or not, while the ones who want to use it for right purposes in a transparent way will not do it because it is regulated or even banned. In short, government must remove limitations to genetic modification in order to ensure transparency of genetic modification for wrong purposes. All in all, these are our two arguments, health, where we explain how allowing free use of genetic modifications will bring a huge leap forward in human healthcare by enhancing further investigation and development, and therefore ensuring the health of not only first world countries, but also developing and underdeveloped countries. And second of all, transparency, where we explain why not removing regulations in human genetic modifications is dangerous if the wrong power falls in the wrong people. It can only be avoided by deregulating it. My team and I strongly believe that governments should indeed remove all limitations in human genetic modifications in order to take advantage of its full potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now we welcome the introduction in the team against the motion, and that would be Raquel.
Can you hear me well?
Just a reminder for everyone to shut their to turn their microphones down during other debater speeches. Yes, Raquel, I can see you and hear you. Can everyone, can all the judges see her and see her?
Yeah, for me it's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see her and hear her well.
Okay, I'll start then. Good morning. My name is Reka Santamaria from Team Hunters of Artemis, and along with my colleagues, Ana Perez and Alberto Pineda, we will firmly defend that government should not remove all limitations on genetic manipulation. Before starting the debate, I would like to clarify what genetic manipulation is. We know genetic manipulation as the direct manipulation of an organism's genes using biotechnology. It's a kind of technology used to change the genetic makeup of cells, including the transfer of genes within and across species to produce improved or novel organisms. By government and their limitations, we refer to the laws and other legal systems made by a government to impact nationally and internationally in agreement with other governments. We have based our argumentative line on three solid reasons: a social argument, the domino effect argument, and the moral argument. Our first argument is the social argument, based on the increase in the gap between developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as overpopulation. We need limitations in order to prevent first world countries from becoming invincible at the expense of letting third world countries decay, since genetic manipulation is only going to be accessible to a bunch of high-income people due to the cost it requires. Have we ever heard of a scientific breakthrough in Uganda? No. But what about in China? What about in the United States? They are the big leaders in all things medical related, which means that these big countries are only going to get bigger, while these poorer countries are left further in the dust. And why is this negative? Because we are dividing society into two groups, people with money and people that don't have money. Our second reason is overpopulation. We need limitations to prohibit the use of genetic engineering to extend life expectancy, as this generates an unsustainable excess population for society as a whole. Diseases are the best form of population control. What will happen if they suddenly disappear, if we get rid of them? Our second argument is the domino effect argument, based on 2 points: the risk that having no limitations entail, and biological warfare. Our first reason is risk. We cannot risk modifying human diseases, as we will never be able to demonstrate beforehand the negative effects that this could have on all living beings, and on the test subject that is being experimented on. We don't know how different species will be affected, or humans for that matter. Our second reason is biological warfare. Because of all of this genetic manipulation, people are able to create or directly modify viruses, bacteria, and harmful substances taken directly from the human gene code. If this biological technology advances, who will assure us that each country will not use it in order to satisfy their own needs? And how would we deal with this unprecedented biological warfare? Therefore, limitations are essential to ensure a future free of social threats. Our last argument is the moral argument, based on 2 important reasons: stereotypes and human experimentation. Our first reason is based on stereotypes. Limitations are essential to put an end to the prejudices that, little by little, have settled into society and generated a considerable decrease in human diversity, since we all want to fit into an already established canon. Our genes are our building blocks, and if we change the blocks that make us who we are, we will all inevitably lose individual ideas and the things that make us, us, the things that make us unique. And on the other hand, coming to our second reason, should we be able to submit a baby to experimentation just so that hypothetically cure a disease, even if we don't know the outcome of such an experiment? And furthermore, is it ethical to use it as a means of punishment against, for example, war criminals? Again, limitations must be established to avoid these types of situations. And so, with these 3 main arguments stated above, my teammates and I firmly believe that governments should not remove all limitations to genetic manipulation, as it could have unprecedented consequences for the future of all humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Raquel. Now we welcome the first rebuttal in the team, in the proposition team, and that would be Monse.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will begin my turn by refuting the opposing team's arguments and then continuing to construct my own. The opposing team brought us 3 very interesting arguments. One being a social argument, where they how removing all regulation to genetic modification would only enhance the inequality between populations, specifically because poor geographical locations would not be able to afford this. However, this can be seen with the example of gold rice, for example, how previously genetically modified organisms have been subsidized by scientific institutions and research centers specifically aimed to developing countries at a very low cost, ensuring that they can actually afford these treatments. Now moving on to the second argument of the domino effect, where they spoke about how there would not be many limitations as onto how these effects would be treated. However, as I will further explain in my argument, if there were less limitations, it would also ensure that these treatments could be only there will also be less limitations for research. So in other words, the safety of these techniques could only be further proven to be safe if there were less limitations. Thirdly, their moral argument of how we would lose a sense of diversity. However, I believe that this argument a lack of explanation as to why this is inherently bad was not given. Now moving on to my own arguments. My first argument is based on human health. No question that gene editing technology are potentially transformative and are the ultimate precision medicine. If you can transform if you could precisely correct or delete genes that are causing problems, that would be the purest form of medicine that there is. It would be so transformative for people with diseases caused by a single gene mutation, like sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. Developing safe, effective ways to use gene editing to treat people with serious diseases with no cures has so much potential to relieve suffering that it is hard to see why anyone would be against it. Despite decades of trying, there are still no vaccines against virus kills tens of millions of people and cause untold suffering, such as HIV and the cancer-causing Epstein-Barr virus. However, genetic modification technology has allowed for a new take on treating these life-threatening diseases, skipping the vaccine and directly introducing the antibody, an idea proposed by the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. In 2017, a team of Chinese researchers successfully increased the resistance to HIV in mice by replicating the mutation of a gene that effectively prevents the virus from entering cells. For now, however, scientists are only doing these experiments on animals, but there is reason to believe that the same methods would work in humans, according to the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine. However, this is not yet legal in many parts of the world due to the ethical implications it carries. Deregulation of genetic modification would only permit faster treatment and less boundaries for research, as I previously mentioned. Genetic modification technologies in humans is only another form of finding cures to diseases we once thought were untreatable or uncurable. Why would anyone be against this? Now moving on to my second argument, transparency. Although we want to admit it or not, right now there is a huge demand for the use of genetic manipulation in areas now banned, such as embryonic development. This can be evidenced by cases as one that recently happened in China, in which a couple's children were genetically modified to be immune to HIV, which also comes from the Society of Royal Medicine. So, regardless if there is regulation, some actors will inevitably go outside of it. Limits on genetic manipulation essentially put those who comply with the law at a disadvantage, and that can be very detrimental to society. So let's put the risk of these twins in China. If genetic manipulation brings no consequence to them, then society has been missing out on a treatment for HIV for a long time because of regulation. But we can also take a look at the negative uses for genetic manipulation. Let's examine the use of genetic manipulation in biologicals that affect humans. There are governments and criminal organizations around the world that don't care about international regulations and could easily use genetic manipulations for weapons. If they were to use weapons, the world would have no way of knowing how to defend against them. The bottom line is that regulation hinders the process of investigation, which I mentioned in my rebuttal to the opposing team's arguments. And this makes us blind to both the possible consequences and benefits that could come from genetic manipulation. If we were to completely deregulate genetic manipulation, this would allow for a considerably larger amount of investigation into it, bringing us closer to completely understand the process much faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Monse. And now we welcome the first rebuttal in the team against the motion, and that would be Alvaro.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can see you and hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, my name is Alberto Pineda, and the structure I'll follow will be very simple. First, I'll rebut the opposing team arguments, and then I'll proceed to construct my own argumentative line. Their first argument is the development of health. However, curing diseases in a massive way, and therefore extending the lifespan of everyone, will make worse one of the biggest problems that we have right now, overpopulation. Overpopulation will end up with all the human race dying. But I have to say that if this were beneficial, it is still not ethical, as in many cases we will be creating life just to give it to someone else. But I have to say, even if this was ethical, only people with money would use this technique. So therefore we will be only treating diseases only from wealthy people, as they are the one that can pay for those. So therefore we are increasing the gap between countries. Now I'll proceed to construct my own argument. Our first argument is the social argument, based on two reasons. The first one being the difference between countries. New technologies are always expensive, so only the households that could afford to take advantage of this technique will perform genetic modification on their children. This means that we will create a division between those with money and people that don't have money. We can even find ourselves living in a world where different classifications of genetic purity could lead to individualized approaches to healthcare, employment, and education. It will become the next for those with money to safeguard the social status and become invincible, while the poor people that cannot use this technique are left to die. They try to rebut the opposing team this argument, saying that it is cheap, but however, according to technology review, modifying only one embryo costs more than 100,000 euros, so therefore it's not cheap, and we are going to increase the difference between countries. Why is this negative? Well, obviously because we are dividing society into two groups. Our sub-argument is overpopulation. This is one of the best methods that we have to fight against the biggest problems nowadays, overpopulation. So if we use genetic modification to extend the lifespan of everyone, we will lose the only method that we have to fight against it. But I also have to say that a longer life isn't always practical. We might open the doors to having more children, require higher level of medical care for a longer time, and increase the economic cost of each family unit. There also could be problems with jobs, with economic disparity, or lack of agriculture space to support everyone. Therefore, we should not eliminate restrictions because we are for to solve diseases, but first we have to solve humanity. Our second sub-argument is the domino effect. The first one is the risk. If there is a change in any sort of life form, it will be undeniably have an impact on other beings, be it plants, animals, or humans. For example, if we modify the Ebola virus so that it no longer affects humans, who is to say that that virus now can affect bats that were never affected? It is impossible to know what the modification of bacteria, viruses, and diseases will have on nature, and it is a risk that we shouldn't be willing to take. We can measure the impact changing on every essence of humans, so we cannot quantify and therefore determine the impact it would have on the world. But this doesn't only affect plants, animals, and nature, but also humans. For example, this was the case of the Chinese scientific He Jiankui, that the opposing team gave the example that tried supposedly to solve HIV. The problem was later found out by a study made by University of Berkeley, which found out that chain using genetic modification led to a lower life expectancy. This is just one of the many risks that we can have. So therefore, we need to maintain the limitation that we have right now to prevent situations like this from happening. In this example that I just gave, we can clearly see that, okay, he was supposedly trying to prevent HIV, but he ended up with a lower life expectancy. So therefore, if we do a balance, we can clearly see that we should not remove limitations. Our second sub-argument is the biological warfare. One of the frightening concerns about human genetic engineering is that military forces, terrorists, and other groups could develop biological weapons from it. This could produce weapons that seek out specific genetic profiles. This disadvantage could result in a surge of unhealthy nationalism, healthcare spending, and global debt, as each nation works to protect its own best interest. And why is this bad? Because in a world where terrorism is increasing, it opens a new whole world for criminals and other groups that could lead to massive death. And the opposing team said that tried to rebut this argument, stating that we have to have control and everybody needs to have transparency. I have to say that right now we have control on nuclear bombs, but we have them, so we can use them. So therefore, it's negative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Alvaro. And now we welcome the second rebuttal in the proposition team, and that would be Juan Pablo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Pablo Avila, and I will first start by refuting the other team's arguments and then start to defend mine. The other teams first bring us a social argument in which they basically talk about the increasing gap, increasing inequality, and overpopulation. First, there wouldn't be an increase in inequality because CRISPR technology is very cheap. They used an evidence to say that editing human embryos would cost $100,000. However, we have an evidence that proves the opposite. We have an evidence from the Stanford Medicine Review that proves that a gene editing toolkit only costs about $65 and can edit multiple genes. So it would be affordable for everyone. And then this overpopulation wouldn't occur no more than it would occur for case of vaccines. You don't say that we should stop developing vaccines because they will cause overpopulation. It's simply not moral to let people die just because of a problem we can deal with in the future. It's like saying that we should let all people die due to coronavirus to stabilize our pension system. It simply does not make sense. And then I want to go to the domino effect argument, and they have 2 points. The first point, they talk about biowarfare, saying that terrorists will be able to develop biological weapons. However, that's the case right now. Terrorists and criminal organizations simply don't care about regulations. So they'll develop these weapons whether we want them to. If we were to completely deregulate the genetic manipulation industry, then we ourselves would be able to examine the possible consequences of these weapons and prepare for them. Because if we keep those regulations, then we will be completely blind to the consequences that these weapons will have on humanity if they are used. So we won't be able to prepare for the use. They also bring a point which is related to risk, on the possible risk that genetic manipulation can have in the long run. However, those risks still exist today, and that's because genetic manipulation is still done today. Although it's regulated, it's still done, and it's tested on people, and people agree to take responsibility for the risks that this can entail. So it would be the exact same case if we deregulated the industry. Your question.
Even if your evidence was true that it costs 65 euros, are you expecting undeveloped countries that don't have access to drinking water to expend 65 euros to modify an embryo?
Look, this goes back to the case of vaccines. You wouldn't expect these countries to be able to afford them. However, polio has been almost completely eradicated in Africa due to efforts from the West, and genetic manipulation would be significantly less expensive than vaccines. So yes, this can be used for undeveloped countries such as those in Africa for immunization with no problem. They also talked about how genetic manipulation could have an undesired effect on other creatures. However, that's exactly what's happening right now because we don't use genetic manipulation. We're making ourselves immune to viruses with antibiotics, and this is the same exact case. These viruses to which we are being immunized can affect other creatures, but it is through genetic manipulation, although it's not a question of the debate, we can manipulate these other creatures to be immune to these viruses, and that's what we do in areas such as agriculture. And then I want to go to their last argument, in which they talk about stereotypes. We can already conform to stereotypes through surgeries such as plastic surgery. So you don't really see everyone having plastic surgery right now. So why would this paradigm shift necessarily cause this change in attitudes? And even if it did cause this change in attitudes, people would still keep their interest and ideas. So we would still have this individuality that the other team says we would lose. And then they talk about human modification, saying how it can be used involuntarily on babies and prisoners of war. However, that's not the case because those don't apply to regulations on genetic manipulation. Those are basic human rights. If someone doesn't want to be experimented on, he simply can refuse to do this. This has no relationship with limitations on genetic manipulation. It has to do with human rights. So at the end, people would still need to agree. There would need to be consent for you to be subject to genetic manipulation. And finally, the only argument they refuted to us was our argument of human health, basically talking about how we can't improve human health because at the end we will be causing overpopulation. However, I already said how this does not make sense and it's actually not ethical. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, Juan Pablo. Now we welcome the second rebuttal in the opposition team, and that would be Ana Perez.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you.
Okay. Good morning, my name is Ana Perez, and the structure of the floor will be very simple. First, I rebut the opposing team's arguments, and then I proceed to construct our own argumentative line. So first, I'd like to come back to their second argument, in which they talk about a need for transparency, so that because we don't want the weapons that could happen through genetic manipulations to fall in the wrong hands. And we believe that yes, we do not want people to be able to access these weapons. And the way to do that is to not develop them in the first place. If you do not have something, you cannot use it in a negative way. Not only this, but it is true that we cannot go blind on matters regarding genetic manipulation. That is why there is still research maintaining the limitations so that it doesn't go too far as to actually cause damage. So in a way, we are researching and development in a sure and slow and safe way. Not only this, but even if we took the limitations away, there still wouldn't be any of the transparency you're talking about. As people that want to use this technology for wrong purposes, we still do so. The thing that happens is in order to prevent people from believing that they can do as they please. If we take limitations away, we are setting a dangerous precedent, letting people believe that they can do as they please. Then the opposing team tried to rebut our first reason inside the social argument, saying that genetic manipulation is cheap and that it will be able to go to developing countries. However, as my colleague already introduced, this genetic manipulation is not cheap. And sure, you might have an evidence. We also have an evidence. So let's rebut with something that's not evidence, with logic. New technologies are always expensive. Why? Because since they're new, they require a lot of investment. So it just makes sense to know that these technologies will not be cheap. Not only this, but they won't access the developing countries. As stated by UNICEF, 6.5 million people still do not have running water. If they do not have running water, how are they going to get the state-of-the-art technology of genetic manipulation? Sure, we might give them subsidies, but this still won't be enough. The gap will keep increasing. Then the opposing team tried to rebut by saying that overpopulation is a problem in the future. However, this is not true, because if suddenly through genetic manipulation we can cure everyone, it wouldn't be sustainable in a very soon future. So yes, between saving a life today and saving the entire human race tomorrow, we can believe that saving the entire human race is much more important, even as it pains us to say so. You had a question? Yes, please.
Yeah. Don't you believe that even if governments are still regulating genetic modification, those terrorists and authoritarian governments will still use it for weapons? And therefore, in order to have transparency, we should deregulate it?
Thank you for your question. As I already said before, even if we took the limitations, we still wouldn't have transparency, because people will still be using this in negative ways if they have the knowledge to do so. Now, I'd like to come back to our third argument, which is the moral argument. Our first reason was the stereotypes, because people's actions are often guided by stereotypes, which leads to a lack of diversity. Why? Because everyone would like to have a baby with certain characteristics, tall, strong, and even if it's not all of us, most of us will follow this beauty stereotype in order to have the perfect child. Therefore, if we allow for the removal of all limitations, we will lose diversity, losing in turn different points of view, because who we are is determined by these genes. Take the example of a house. If you change the building blocks of a house, you are changing the end product. So again, this is very crucial. The opposing team also mentioned how this is just like cosmetic surgery, but it is not like that. Through genetic manipulation, you can change the IQ of a person. So again, this is much more important than cosmetic surgery. Then our second point was human experimentation, because to know if a certain type of genetic therapy will work, you first need to experiment by using human trials. Now, it is true that currently human trials are legal, but they have many constraints and limitations. And if we take the limitations regarding genetic manipulation, we will in turn also be taking some of the limitations regarding human trials. And why is this bad? Because experimenting with a human gene pool is much more risky than having trials for antibiotics or medicinal drugs. The limitations on the methods used will also be eliminated. Do we really want to allow for a person, for example, a war prisoner, to be experimented on in order to test out a new genetic therapy? Regardless of what these people did, they are still human, and they should not, under any circumstances, be experimented on as a means of torture or as a means to an end. We have to maintain these limits because it's the ethically correct choice. And if left to companies and private organizations, it wouldn't be like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Ana. Now we welcome the conclusion in the opposition team, and that would be Raquel.
Good morning. My name is Reka Santamaria from Team Hunters of Artemis, and I would like to thank the judges, the public, and our opposing team for such a thrilling debate. Now I'd like to come back to the most important points that have been previously mentioned. Our opposing team had two main arguments. In their first argument, they spoke about the development of new medicines, of how we will help people have a longer life expectancy. And we said, yes, this may be true, but more life expectancy leads to more overpopulation, which is condemning all of humanity. Do we really want to save a few lives to kill 1,000? And besides, even if there was no overpopulation, it is still not ethical, because often when there is human experimentation involved, we are taking a life in order to save another. And again, even if it were ethical, it would still be discriminatory, as only the rich can afford these new medical treatments, because, as we have already explained, it is very expensive to genetically modify a human being. In their second argument, they spoke about the need for transparency so that weapons, biological weapons, don't fall into the wrong hands. And however, we said, with limitations, we will have less of these weapons than if these limitations were gotten rid of. And yet, even if they got rid of all limitations, this transparency still wouldn't exist. Because if bad people want these weapons, they are somehow going to get them. For example, the black market. Now I'd like to come back to our own arguments. Our first argument was a social argument, in which we spoke about the increase in gap between rich and poor countries, and inside of rich countries, between rich and poor people. Because genetic modification is generally very expensive, even though the opposing team tried to tell us that it was cheap. Now, there may be some instances where it was cheap being 100 euros instead of 1,000, but this is still not cheap for many countries where they don't even have drinkable water. We also spoke about overpopulation, and how if there's more life expectancy, there will be more people harming the ecosystem, which means more deaths for a future. Now you said, isn't it not moral to let people die? And of course it's not moral to let people die. But does that mean we should condemn humanity? Because by saving 100 people, we may be killing 1,000 more with overpopulation and unsustainability. In our second argument, we spoke about the risks of how it is impossible to know what will happen when we modify a person, how it will impact the nature and the ecosystem, and how the experimentee himself or herself will be affected. We also spoke about biological warfare and how terrorists and governments can use these new genetically modified people to target humanity as a whole, as we will all have similar gene code, and therefore we will be susceptible to the same viruses. And lastly, our moral argument. Is it okay to experiment on a child, even have a say in what will happen to them? Because you said people can refuse, and yet, how can they refuse if you are experimenting on an embryo and on a baby who has nothing to say on what will happen to them? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Raquel. And now to close the final debate, we welcome the conclusion in the proposition team, and that would be Carolina.
Well, good morning. My name is Carolina, and I will be doing the conclusion of this debate. So firstly, I'd like to go through their arguments and show how our arguments actually stood standing while theirs fell because of our refutations. So they brought us three main arguments, and they brought us firstly a social one, which they said that it had genetic modifications enhances equality, but we showed how CRISPR is actually very cheap with the standard evidence saying that it costs only $65, and not only that, but we also talked about how the Golden Rights Project is directly aimed for developing countries by scientific institutions. And furthermore, polio is an example how the West is contributing to helping the poor. And this is clear refutation to what they said about the high expenses of genetic modifications, as they brought us a logic of fallacy, because something new doesn't mean it has to be expensive, but we have shown how the rich can actually contribute and help the poor in this situation. And they also said that genetic modification brings us overpopulation, and we said, our second refutator said, that it is not moral to let people die. And how can they be defending morality when they say that we should let people die because of those lives? And furthermore, they did not consider at any time that people could still work during when the lifespan increases, and that's why they didn't really evidence any of the statements they gave us. So this is why their social arguments doesn't really stand. And furthermore, the domino effect argument, we told them that terrorists can actually still do what they want to, even if but if we deregulate it, we could have a better knowledge of what are the limitations and how can we tackle the problem. Because if we do not do anything now, we won't be able to do anything once the problem comes. And the third argument, the morality, they talked about lose a sense of diversity and ideas. May I reinforce ideas? And our first refutator said that, wow, this is intrinsically bad. They didn't really give any reasoning to that. But furthermore, our second refutator also said that interests and ideas cannot be changed by genetic modifications, because that is something that you develop through your life. And furthermore, we also talked about free will and informed consent, which means that these people will not be subject to this experimentation if they do not want to. So how is this unfair to the poor, and how is this unfair to the rich? So this is how their three arguments do not really stand standing compared to ours, which were health and transparency. And in our health argument, we talked about that we can skip vaccine and reach antibodies directly, and they say that it's only for the wealthy people, but this is a logical fallacy, as explained before. And the transparency argument, it's clear that it stands because they didn't really refute it, did right directly, and our refutations were really stronger. And that is why we believe that because of our health argument and transparency arguments, we should remove all limitations to genetic modification. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Carolina. And now the debate of the final in English has ended.